Hello, I'm Christina Rutsky from the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. This seminar is part of an occasional series about doing things differently, looking at society, politics and economics during and after the current COVID-19 crisis. Today we're looking at ethnic inequalities in the pandemic. Chairing this discussion will be Bridget Byrne, Professor of Sociology and Director of CODE, the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity and Inequality based at the university, which provides theoretically informed, empirically grounded and policy relevant research on ethnic inequalities in the UK.
Hello, Christina, thank you very much. Yes, all of us speaking today actually are from the Department of Sociology, but we're also members of or affiliated to CODE. And I want to start with a plug for this book, which has just come out with the Runnymede Trust that we've written, which looks at the last ethnic inequalities in the UK in the last 50 years. And what it shows, it demonstrates the kind of entrenched social and economic inequalities faced by ethnic minority people on a range of levels, produced by both structural and institutional racism and other forms of discrimination. So in a way, this seminar this conversation is to look at how those entrenched inequalities have been worsened by COVID-19 and lockdown across a range of areas. If we think about the inequalities in housing, in people living in deprived neighbourhoods, and in employment and forms of employment. And so this is a good place to start if you want to think about why the impact of COVID has such a varied effect. So I'm going to ask first James Nazroo to talk a little bit about how the broader impacts of lockdown on those people facing persistent inequalities and vulnerabilities. James?
Thanks, Bridget. As Bridget said, I'm a member of the Department of Sociology at the University of Manchester. And I do my research mainly around ethnic inequalities in health. And so focusing on why inequalities in other domains of life drive ethnic inequalities in health. And so this has been one of the kind of stark appearances of the COVID-19 crisis. The differences in health across different ethnic groups have really brought ethnic inequalities to the fore in the minds of the media, in the minds of people who are looking at what's going on their TVs, and has forced it into a policy agenda. And on the whole, this has been an extremely shocking situation. People have seen the much higher death rates amongst ethnic minority people in the UK and elsewhere. For those of us who've been working in this area, it's not a surprise. And I think it's very important to note that. And that's because, as Bridget has said, we have documented across a whole range of domains, ethnic inequalities that have persisted over decades. Changed perhaps in some form, but nevertheless persisted over decades. And this is the same for ethnic inequalities in health. The ethnic inequalities in health that have become very visible because of COVID-19 have been there before COVID-19. And so COVID-19 has just made this very much more visible. But what COVID-19 has also done is force our policy, public health leaders to think about ethnic inequalities in health in a way that they hadn't done before. So they have been forced to do this, I think, because of the media coverage. And the public complaint about these shocking, stark inequalities. It was the media that brought this to the fore, the images of black doctors dying, black nurses dying, then media investigations that began to identify evidence for this to be more systematic than just chance. And then the public health bodies began to look at data, began to collect data, and began to identify robust evidence that these inequalities are marked. Just to give you an example, the data are presented in very confusing ways, but just to give you a very, very simple example, an area with a 10% higher ethnic minority population than another area has a 5 in 100,000 higher rate of death. This is from COVID-19. This is a major, major difference. An area that has twice the ethnic minority population of another area has a 25% increase in COVID-19 related deaths. These are very simple facts that we're told they're complicated. They're not complicated, they're very simple facts. And they are driven by the inequalities that we see in other domains of life. So the economic inequalities that are faced by ethnic minority people, the fact that those economic inequalities lead to other health inequalities, which then make people more vulnerable to a COVID-19 infection, the kind of jobs that ethnic minority people end up being concentrated in, like transport or health, security, and so on. And what underlies that, of course, are the processes of racism that operate in our society that lead to people being placed in more marginal, more precarious, more vulnerable locations. And related to that, I know Gary wants to say something, but related to that, of course, then we have to think about what happens during lockdown. And we are now beginning to see all the evidence of the great economic harms that are being, that are following lockdown. But we also know that these aren't distributed evenly across the population. So people in more vulnerable, more precarious jobs, people in poorer housing, people in more deprived communities are going to be much more impacted upon by the economic harms that flow from the lockdown process. I'll stop it there because I know Gary wants to say something. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, James, how you would explain the denial that exists that this is to do with inequality. If you look at the government review, the kind of persistent desire to talk about vitamin D deficiency, there is quite a concerted effort not to accept what you've said. Yeah. And I'm wondering how you would frame it.
Yeah, so we've had systematic policy inquiries into inequalities in health since the late 70s. And there have been a series of them. And almost, not quite, but almost universally, they have ignored ethnicity. And so there was some investigation of that in the late 90s. But over the last 20 years, there has been almost no discussion of ethnic inequality in these public health inquiries. The result of that is that although we have lots of evidence on ethnic inequalities in health now, the result of that is that policymakers do not have the tools to understand ethnic inequalities in health. And so they take a common sense approach to thinking what ethnicity is. It's about genes, it's about culture, instead of thinking about the other things that are crucial to health and that are driving these differences in health. And you just, and it is really, I guess, so naive, because you just make a simple comparison between a Bangladeshi family living in Tower Hamlets and a black family living in Detroit. And the genetic and cultural similarities between these groups are non-existent. But what is present is that they're both living in deprived communities in marginalized locations. And that's what's driving their differences in health. So why then does it disappear from the policy documentation? Well, it's easy to take a kind of conspiracy theory approach. Why did the evidence that Public Health England collected from the lived experiences of people who went to their consultation meetings, why did that evidence not appear in the report? Why did the evidence from academics like me who also went to those meetings and talked about racism and discrimination, why did that also not appear in their report? And I think it's in part because, as I said earlier, the tools aren't there, but also in part because people don't want to be confronted by these inequalities.
And when you say the tools aren't there, sorry, James, say a little bit more about that.
I'm really arguing, and so this is a kind of semi-academic point, I'm really arguing that the conceptual tools for understanding ethnic inequalities, which are clearly present in a whole range of disciplines, but are not present in public health because they have never been systematically integrated into thinking about inequalities of health. So we as sociologists have a set of tools that we can draw upon, as can political scientists and economists, but they are not present in the public health field.
Yes, Karis has a question.
No, it's more kind of just thinking about how the framing of the issue and the avoidance of race and the avoidance of kind of naming it for what it is. You can kind of see that. I know I'm jumping slightly, but I'm thinking about my research on ethnic inequalities in higher education. And in recent years, one of the kind of ways of dealing with that, and one of the things that universities have been very keen to take up, is the concept of unconscious bias. And we see that being rolled out across the sector, like unconscious bias training, as a way to absolve us of our biases and move us into a kind of more equal and just society. And I think part of the problem is with that is that it blames racism and institutional issues on individuals, and it doesn't name whiteness. It doesn't name those inequalities for what they are. And I think that's something that's just seen across our institutions, really, a kind of lack of bravery, really, in naming things for what they are, and approaching policy in that way. So yeah, it's just an add-on, really, James, to think about how that kind of avoidance manifests in the higher education sector as well.
See, I wonder, and this is an open question, I don't know the answer, but I wonder whether it is a lack of bravery, or whether it's actually the presence of knowledge, you know, that they know that's what it is. Mm-hmm. There is no other explanation. And that to acknowledge it would then demand a series of actions that cost money and address power and so on. And so they would rather just not know it. Do you know what I mean? It's that thing when people talk about speaking truth to power. I think it was Chomsky who said that power knows what the truth is. The problem isn't that power doesn't know what the truth is. The issue is that, you know, the power structures have decided that they prefer to lie. And I just wonder the extent to which it is that I don't know, that they're squeamish and they just kind of, you know, that they don't want to name it, and the extent to which they don't want to name it because after naming it, then would come the pressure to do something about it.
Yeah, I think it makes it palatable, the discussion, when it's framed in those ways. But also, I think I agree, like unconscious, to think about these issues in terms of individualized unconscious biases is also an apparatus of power, by masking the real issues at stake. So yeah, I think there's some design in that purposefully. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, James.
No, I was just going to say it's an interesting contrast between the kind of focus on the ways in which institutions operate and obscure the operation of power within them by this move to unconscious bias. But also, I think, Gary, you're suggesting that there are vested interests here as well. So it's not just institutions and the ways in which institutions operate, but it's the way in which people who have power within those institutions operate to support their vested interests.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, once one acknowledges the root causes of these inequalities and one assumes resolves to do something about it, that upturns quite a big apple cart in terms of kind of what is necessary. And when I think back to the Macpherson report, in that moment when some people started saying, well, we're going to have to do this now, that was when people got kind of squished. So long as there was mourning and fretting and a useful morality tale with the police and so on, then that was one thing. But then when it was like, well, these next 2 hires are going to need to be black people, or, you know, or whatever, at that point, people were like, whoa. Nobody said we were going to take this seriously. Nobody said it's going to affect me. And it just moves into a kind of different terrain.
I think I realised we've forgotten to introduce ourselves. So Karis, just thinking about that, how institutions respond to the challenge, if you like. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself and your research and how you think COVID has impacted on the questions that you've been looking at.
Yeah, so my name's Karis Campion. I'm a researcher at Code, and I'm currently exploring ethnic inequalities in higher education, how they manifest at various levels for students, and for both students of colour and staff. And obviously, since COVID started and this whole situation has unfolded, I've started to think a little bit more about how existing inequalities in higher education will likely be exacerbated by the current situation. So, especially thinking about kind of access and entrance into higher education. So at the moment, there's actually quite a positive picture in terms of participation in higher education when it comes to students of colour. So there's been like a 60% increase in participation since 2003-04. About 22% of all UK students from ethnic minority backgrounds. So they're actually overrepresented in the higher education population. But then once they get here, they don't do as well as white students. Their attainment is not as good as a 13 percentage points attainment gap between white and students of colour. So the inequalities are there. And with the COVID-19 situation, what the worry is how those things will become more entrenched in future. So think about the next cohort of students that hope to start in September. There's already differential outcomes in admissions. So BME students are less likely to get places at Russell Group institutions, even when you account for previous grades. So thinking about the current situation with A-level students and the fact that they are now going to have to learn calculated grades, we need to think clearly and critically about what that means for those students. So the Runnymede Trust have already put out a number of statements and open letters to the government to make clear that the evidence shows that BME students are most likely to have their grades underpredicted. So when you have that situation where students are already less likely, BME students are already less likely to enter these kind of higher tariff institutions, especially, even when they have the same grades as other as white students. When you think now about predicted grades and those really not being the grades that they will likely have achieved, then we need to think more clearly about how that's going to impact on their entrance into universities. And I think this is a time for higher education institutions to be a bit more bold about how they do their admissions processes. So there's a lot of research that's been done by people at Durham University, so Vicky Bolivar, who stresses the need for institutions to be a bit more brave in thinking about taking account of how the contextual disadvantages that students from BME backgrounds might face and how that might impact on their ability to achieve the grades to get into university, to get into especially higher tariff institutions. So I think one of the things that needs to be done is for universities to think more boldly and bravely about how they do contextual admissions. So thinking about the fact that these students will likely have their grades underpredicted, how might we then think about reductions in offers for those students? You know, so I think the research by Vicky has shown that students who at A-level get AAB are still 88% likely to finish their degree and succeed and do well. And that's compared to students coming in with BCC who are 80% as likely to complete their study. So we need to think about weighing up the risks and benefits of contextual offers and thinking about how we make sure that this generation of students who are coming into our universities in September are given equal access. So I think there's ways that we need to be bold and brave in how we do that. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking through in my research at the moment. Yeah, so thinking about entrance and thinking about how we get those students in to university, and also the issue of students that are here right now, especially BME students and their prospects for graduation. So, you know, what jobs are they going into? The job market's disappeared overnight. You know, graduate internships. You know, I had an internship straight after my degree, and that definitely set me on the right track to then get another job, to eventually do my master's degree. These opportunities are just disappearing overnight. So I think one of the ways that we can think about supporting students, especially Black students and BME students, is to think about postgraduate study and postgraduate research opportunities as well. Because we know that there's hardly any Black professors. Well, we have you now, Gary. You're added to, you'll grow the 0.6%. You know, it's pretty bleak. And I think this is an opportunity to be quite bold and think about, okay, well, if there's no jobs to go into, how might we nourish and grow the next generation of Black and BME academics? How might we do that? So I think, yeah, it's a chance to be bold. It's a chance to kind of reset and rethink the way things are done. So I see it as an opportunity, really, this terrible time, an opportunity to do things a bit differently. So yeah, sorry, I've probably spoken too much. It's supposed to be in conversation.
So I mean, it raises the question that we were talking about before about the willingness of institutions to take those actions, I guess, which your research also looks into a bit. But Gary, you had a question. You're on mute.
It was precisely that. It was that kind of, why haven't they, and why would they, I guess. What is, given the shocking paucity of Black professors, which I was tangentially aware of, and then, you know, when I made this career shift, I realized that we're like white rhinos, really, that there are so few. That didn't happen by accident, I wouldn't have thought. So I'm wondering, given that we're here for, you know, given a series of processes, why would they change now? What would make them change?
Yeah, so this for me, like Karis, I wonder if this is a point of opportunity for campaign for change and for change to actually be achieved. So despite the horror of the inequalities that are being generated by COVID-19, it does also make us have to confront those inequalities. And it may well be that that over time they will just disappear back into the background, but it may also be that this does become a moment where very active campaigning can produce some forms of change as people are confronted with these inequalities, some of which could perhaps be conceived of as accidental consequences of deliberate bad behaviour. So why there are no Black professors are because of broader inequalities, but we could do stuff within institutions potentially to address what's happening within that institution, potentially. But one of the consequences of the lack of Black professor, of course, is that those Black students or those ethnic minority students are not in a culture where they can see people like them succeeding. And I'm just wondering what happens in a lockdown situation where the students are even further distanced from their Black professors, what that means for their educational outcomes. So it's not just predicted grades which don't reflect their real achievements, but also potentially what happens to them in a virtual classroom, where they are potentially even more, or may feel even more alienated from the culture within which they're receiving their education.
Yeah, and there's something to be said as well about the fact that BME students are much more likely to be commuter students, much more likely to be stay-at-home students. So they'll be at home trying to work in conditions and circumstances that will be very, very different from their kind of white middle-class counterparts. And it will be a hindrance, you know, at the end of the day. And then also thinking about those few Black members of staff that are out there teaching those students, you know, they tend to end up doing a lot of the pastoral care as well for BME students who feel more comfortable potentially to come to them with their issues and problems. So it's thinking about how we can support staff to support the students, you know, and so that doesn't become a burden for those particular members of staff as well during this time who might be having to perform that kind of extra labour during lockdown. So it's kind of, it works to produce particular effects for students and staff, and also those many staff from ethnic minority backgrounds are more likely to be on temporary contracts and things like that. So, you know, this is a time when they will have to be kind of putting all their efforts into, especially if you're on a teaching contract, putting all their efforts into shifting things into online learning. And that obviously then has a detrimental impact on their ability to do their research, get their publications out. So it's kind of, yeah, it's thinking about how this is going to impact the staff and students in various realms of their study and their working life and their careers. So universities need to be privy to that, I think, and also not roll back on services that provide that kind of pastoral care, counselling services and whatever else when they're considering what to chop from their budgets, because obviously we know that universities are going to be very squeezed right now. So it's worrying to think how and what will get prioritised when thinking these things through.
I think that's a challenge for the whole of the education sector as well, is about that question of the shift to online learning and the ways in which it's exposed such stark inequalities in access to the equipment required to do that on the part of students, and really about not making cuts but making spendings. You know, why are we not providing our students with computers in order to enable them to access the learning? You hear of students writing essays on mobile phones, and that, you know, is a situation that really can't be tolerated. So I guess this maybe, I'm trying to link this back to the question of what needs to be done in order to address this, and to go to you, Gary Younge, on thinking about, you've argued for a kind of large-scale inquiry looking at the impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minorities, and I wanted you just to explain what you think what difference that could make.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with James and Karis that it offers an opportunity. I think, sadly, it offers an opportunity to everybody, including those who would do us harm. There is if we look back to the financial crisis, say, which offered an opportunity to think about capitalism differently. And in a sense, lots of people did. There was Occupy Wall Street. There'd been a range of things. We had Jeremy Corbyn, and the kind of socialism is now once again kind of, somewhat popular among young Americans, notwithstanding kind of various ways in which that word can be interpreted, on the one hand. On the other hand, what we've been through years of austerity, attacks on public sector workers, and so on. And so the ability to draw precisely the wrong or contradictory conclusions from a moment are also kind of are also possible, and then in ways that Karis just outlined, because Black and BME people are more vulnerable, just in what looks like a general a-racial, economically savvy cull, we will be overrepresented in the kind of in how that operates. And we're actually only just coming out of, I think it was just a few months before COVID hit and the lockdown hit, that kind of wages have gone back up to the real level of kind of 2008, and we were the most affected, particularly Black women, by that crisis. And so there is an opportunity. There's also, I think, there's lots of opportunities. There's also lots of potential kind of downsides, and I think that it's in play. I think that to some extent it's up to us as intellectuals, as kind of people who meddle in the world of ideas, to kind of put these ideas out there as forcefully as we can, for the reason that James just outlined. That kind of there was the anecdotal thing of like looking at the pictures of who died and thinking, hang on, before we knew anything, just thinking, hang on, there's something going on there, and then the first kind of evidence of any kind of data actually confirming what we could all see, and then came the arguments and the pressure, and then came this review, but it's insufficient, and people are pushing for more. And I think that kind of, for me, the the purpose of a review, of a kind of an inquiry, of a public inquiry, is to, unlike, say, the Macpherson report, where an awful lot of that inquiry could be about specific accountability of this policeman and that and the police structures and so on, I think this is a broader, more narratively based, more qualitative kind of examination that first of all establishes the facts of who died and the disproportionality and how that works, and kind of works hard at kind of an intersectional process for that. So you look at kind of, well, we are the more deprived, but the doctors aren't the most deprived. So then why, what are we talking about when we're talking about a disproportionate number of doctors dying, and who does the rotas and all that kind of stuff? But that beyond that, kind of like, how did Pakistanis get to be taxi drivers? How did African people get to be security guards? Why are non-white people more likely to do Uber or kind of work in that particular part of the health service and so on, which I think is going to be, I think there will be kind of data that one can use, but I also think that there is a kind of almost a narrative quality to that in terms of kind of actually learning from a large number of people's stories. And what that can do, in a way that Macpherson did, is kind of teach us how to have this conversation in a meaningful way, how to discuss systemic racism in a meaningful way. And the fact that the Macpherson report did give some grounding for a kind of national conversation about institutional racism, obviously it didn't mean that racism went away. Obviously it didn't mean that people didn't stop practicing racism or try and overturn it, but it gave us something to kind of refer back to, which we still do, and that this would be a kind of, this offers a kind of clear opportunity for an independent, people don't trust the government, I don't trust the government anyway with this, and what they've done badly so far, an independent inquiry that kind of answers the really kind of easy, popular question: why? Why us? Why has this happened to us? And in the absence of that, what kind of we're saying is it doesn't really matter. Lots of people have died. They all look the same. They all died. What are you going to do? There's nothing to say. And one doesn't have to gainsay the conclusion to force the question.
Yeah, I've kind of been thinking a little bit about the possibilities of an independent inquiry and what might be achieved doing that and what form that might take. And it's kind of interesting when you hear the kind of politicians and the way they've spoken about this. So if I remember correctly, Matt Hancock initially announced an inquiry into the higher rate of death amongst ethnic minority people. And that very rapidly changed into a review and then into an evidence review. And I think the Public Health England report is a consequence of being an evidence review, in part a consequence of being an evidence review. There's very little evidence that they had access to. They just reiterated the evidence we already knew, instead of being an inquiry. And then more recently, there's been questions again about whether there should be an inquiry. And I can't remember which politician, whether it was Matt Hancock again, saying there will need to be many inquiries into COVID. And so my concern is the way in which something that is framed around COVID becomes too broad to specifically address ethnic. And again, that happened in the Public Health Evidence Review. The first section was about age and the fact that older people die more than younger people. And then there was a bit on various other dimensions of people's identity. So I think it's very important that we have an inquiry around ethnicity. But I would argue, and I think it kind of comes from what you were saying, Gary, that this inquiry should be broader. And I would argue that it should be broader by focusing on health. And that may sound a bit odd to say broad and health, but if you focus on health inequalities, if you focus on the ways in which certain people are more at risk of adverse health outcomes, then you have to ask why. And then you begin to touch on all the things that you were talking about, Gary, and that you were talking about, Karis, as well. You know, why do people have poorer outcomes from education? What are the consequences of that, and how does that lead to poor health? Or tracing back the other way, how does their poor health result from those educational inequalities that you and Bridget, of course, have also been studying? And you know, how does the decline of the manufacturing industry in the Northwest result in taxi drivers, and how does that then lead to inequalities, precarity in the labour market, which then lead to inequalities in health? So I would argue for a broad inquiry around ethnic inequalities in health and the drivers of that, with COVID-19 as the pressing case for that, but not just focused on COVID-19.
That's fascinating in a way, because it does get back to what you were saying before about how one of the potential problems of just looking at health is that it leads to that understanding of the problem as somehow genetic or cultural practices. So in a way, what you're asking for is a focus on health, but an understanding of health that is much broader and using a range of concepts that you say have not previously been very well used within public health, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I argue that health is a social phenomenon. So we think of it in terms of our internal biology, but actually it's a consequence of social processes, just as I argue that ethnicity is a social construction which relies on racialized concepts.
I mean, I think, I don't think I disagree with you, James, actually. I mean, my feeling is that in the same way that Macpherson starts with Stephen Lawrence, but it doesn't end there. Yeah. It kind of uses that to talk about policing, not just the Metropolitan Police, or at least that's how it's understood. And then there was a willingness publicly to go from that to kind of talk about institutional racism elsewhere, that kind of COVID is the portal in order to kind of have that kind of broader conversation. And I guess kind of we're also all in agreement that when we say we want a public inquiry, we want it to be good. You know, we want it to be led by someone that we trust, and to kind of be thorough in its undertaking. That all of these things that one demands, they always carry the possibility of them doing something like this most recent evidence review, and just saying, well, you know, we've dealt with that. And that's where I think that kind of where we come back to it still being in play, and us still having a role in terms of kind of raising the issues, raising awareness, that kind of notwithstanding the huge majority this government's got, it did not continue with the surcharge on nurses because they just couldn't sustain it. The Dominic Cummings kind of situation, they're all examples, and this is not a partisan point, it's a kind of general point, that they are vulnerable to public pressure. And some of that pressure is the kind of intellectual work of framing where to put the pressure on.
I do agree there's more public pressure. Like, yeah, I mean, just thinking about, again, bringing it back to the higher education point, and I don't want to move it away too much, but we have to kind of, I guess, at some point acknowledge the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movements that have been happening globally in response to that. But universities were very, very quick to put out statements of solidarity with their Black staff and students, and you know, say they're committed to the progression of their Black staff and students, and so on and so forth. And you know, students themselves on social media would have just not been having any of it at all. Like, you know, they've been very publicly kind of saying, okay, but where I haven't seen one black professor during my whole time at this institution. Hang on, aren't black students more likely to drop out at a rate much higher than white students, Asian students, and so on? So it's kind of like these public statements of solidarity that the kind of neoliberal institutions like universities are trying to come out with now. There seems to be less space to do that without there being quite significant challenges and pushback. And I don't think that momentum will just kind of fizzle. I think it's been done in a very public way. That's kind of, yeah, again, opens up opportunity potentially to hold institutions and governments to account in ways that maybe we haven't been able to in like the recent past. I definitely feel the mood feels slightly different, in my opinion.
well, maybe that's I agree with you. I think I think the mood is different, both because the universities jumped on the bandwagon and also because the tires were, you know, deflated and they're jumping in a way. But maybe that's a good point to end. So I'll hand it back to you, Christina.
Thank you to all of you for that really interesting discussion and your amazing insights into this very, very broad issue. So thanks to everybody, and stay safe and goodbye.